Hey y'all, welcome back to episode 3 of our How to Start a Sourdough Starter series. Thank you, Jesus. I am super excited because at 12 o'clock last night, I came downstairs and little Miss New Starter was showing out. The starter had risen all the way up to the top of the jar. Now, you know, when we started yesterday, we put this mark in, the second mark. So the first mark was here, and then the second one. And you can see how it rose all the way up to the top of the jar. And so at 12 o'clock last night, I stirred it down, and then it sank. Then it rose again. So when I got up this morning, it was actually back up to here. So Little Miss New Starter is doing really, really good. And oh wow, it's so you can hear it. It's very active. That's the rye flour, the organic rye. Really, really helps you get an active starter a little faster. So it's smelling like a sourdough starter. So that's another thing. It should at this point, it's 3 days out. It should start to smell like a sourdough starter now. It won't be like an established starter, which will have a very sour smell, but it should have some sourness at this point. Now, this is day 3 for this sourdough starter. If your sourdough starter at day 3 is not bubbling like this and it's not smelling sour, the first indication is you should see bubbles. And once you get it active, you should start to smell it. It should start smelling like a sourdough starter. If yours is not doing that, put it back in a warm place. And after you feed it, put it back in a warm place and just be patient with it. It will do something. It won't do nothing. It'll do something. If you're using the right flours, unbleached flours, and some whole wheat rye or whole grain rye or whole wheat flour, it'll do something. So just be patient. So let's go ahead and pour off. I'm going to discard half of this. Now, I'm not going to throw this discard away. You don't have to either. This is the perfect time to use your sourdough starter. It's your first discard, so you shouldn't throw it away. It will be perfect to use for crackers or waffles or pancakes or biscuits or whatever. So I'm going to use this. I'm not going to throw this away. So this is our first discard. Now you can see I'm back down to the original line on the jar. I've discarded it back down to that original line, which is about a little more than ½ an inch of starter remaining in the jar. So now it's time to go ahead and give it a feed. So let's we're doing this in ounces or grams. So I'm going to be doing this in grams, but you can do it in ounces. So originally it was 60 grams of water and 60 grams of flour. So I'm going to go ahead and add in my 60 grams of water. And let me be a little slow because I could pour way too much. There we are, 60 grams. Now the difference between when I was first feeding it with its first 2 feeds, this feed, I'm not going to feed it with the whole grain rye. I'm going to feed it with all-purpose flour, just regular unbleached all-purpose flour. So an equal amount, 60 of flour, 60 of water. Or 60 of water, 60 of flour. Since this starter is already showing me that it has lots of activity, you don't need to continue feeding it with the rye flour when your starter is showing activity. That's not strictly necessary. You can actually get an overactive starter, which would require you to feed it a lot more. So that's why I'm using the all-purpose flour, because it's already very active. Now, if I was to feed this once again with the blend of the whole grain rye flour by 12 o'clock tonight, I probably would have to give it a feed. So if you choose to do that, that's fine. At 12 o'clock tonight, just give your starter a feed and do a half of the original, which would be 30 grams of water, 30 grams of flour, and then use 20 grams of all-purpose flour and 10 grams of whole grain rye or whole wheat. But this little starter is already raring to go. So I'm going to go ahead and start giving it that feed. Now, let's talk about how, at this point, what kind of flour you continue to feed your starter with. At this point, this starter for me is going to be fed from here on out with all-purpose flour, because depending on how often I'm going to use it, I don't want to have to feed it every 12 hours. I'm content with feeding it once every 24 hours. If you are going to use your starter more active, or if more not active, if you need your starter to be more active and you're going to use it more frequently, go ahead and feed it with the blend of the rye and the all-purpose. But unless you plan on baking bread, say this evening, or if you're going to bake biscuits or whatever tomorrow morning, you don't need to feed it every 12 hours. So the more whole grain you give it, the more active you make your sourdough starter. And the more active your sourdough starter is, the more frequently you're going to have to feed it. Keep that in mind. The more ripe it is, the more feeding it's going to need. So if you can, as I say, there are many ways of kind of controlling your sourdough starter. We can only control it so much because it is wild yeast. So you only have so much ability to control it. But one of those things is temperature and what you're feeding it. Now, speaking of feeding, I do want to, because I've heard of some people will put like potato starch in a sourdough starter. Some people even put sugar. Those will give you very, very super active, crazy active starters. The reason why I don't is because those starters they'll bubble, but then they crash very quickly. And then sometimes you cannot restart those starters. They will literally overexert themselves and they can die. And then you're back to square one. You don't want to feed a sourdough starter with sugar. There are people who do. I don't suggest that you do, because when you introduce sugar into a sourdough starter, it's kind of like giving your kids, 10 candy bars before they go to bed. You've started it. You've done it now and you can't get it out of them. So you don't want to introduce sugar to a sourdough starter at no point. You can add some honey into the actual dough that you're going to make if you want to add sugar that way to feed your sourdough, to feed the mixture. But don't add sugar to the sourdough starter itself, or honey, or any of those things. Regardless of what you hear about how it jump starts and it speeds it, you're sending your sourdough starter into another direction that I haven't had much experience with it, and I don't bother with it. Now, I have heard of those sourdough starters exploding. So, because you're putting something in there that's really, really, really going to ramp up the carbon dioxide in a sourdough starter, and it could get out of control. I mean, let's just put it that way. It can get way out of control, especially if it's in the summertime. Now, to maintain my sourdough starter, I'm a bigger fan of keeping a sourdough starter in a plastic jar, like Miriam. Miriam lives in a plastic jar. And there are some people who are concerned about using plastic, and, I don't have a problem with it. I've always kept my sourdough starters in the plastic jars, and they're food safe, plastic containers, by the way. They're not just plastic containers. They are made for food. And I haven't had any problem. The reason why I prefer it is because in the summertime, not so much in the winter, but in the summertime, a sourdough starter can get very active, especially if I fed it that morning and I know I want to use it that afternoon and it's a very warm day. Sourdough starters double very quickly in that regard. And if I'm not paying attention to it, it can either spill out, or if the lid is on very tight, the lid can pop. And I have done that. Mine has done that. I came downstairs the next morning and I noticed the lid was cracked. And I closed the lid very well. The pressure just builds up in the jar and it pops the lid. So to avoid that worry of your sourdough exploding on you, it's rare that's going to happen, by the way. This is not like, some little tiny bomb in your kitchen. It's not like a pressure cooker. It's not going to do that. But it can, depending on how active your sourdough starter is and how much attention you pay to it. So I just prefer, and I feel more comfortable to leave it in the plastic jar. And that way, if it does, and I come down and I notice, boop, the lid is cracked, I'm like, you got really, really happy there, didn't you, Miriam? But if you choose to use a glass jar, if you do, that's perfectly fine. Use something that's breathable, like a beeswax wrap. I have those, and you can cover it with the beeswax wrap. And then you don't obviously have to worry about that exploding because it's not going to explode. It's not airtight. So that's the thing you want to avoid, is just sealing it airtight, because it kind of does need to breathe at the end of the day. And so my plastic lid is not so tight or airtight that it won't have some give if the jar needs that little extra room to breathe. With that plastic lid, it'll get it, or with the beeswax, it'll get it that way. So I'm going to cover Little Miss New Starter up once again. And this time, actually, I'm going to cover it up with a plastic lid. And I think I have my plastic lid around here. I'm going to cover it up with a plastic lid, and I'm just going to screw it on. Not going to screw it on super tight. I'm just going to, just like that. It should still have some moving. It shouldn't just be screwed down real tight. And then I'm going to put this back and where I keep it in a nice warm place. And this is how you proceed with your starter until you got it a fully established starter. And that'll probably take you about a week of doing this until your starter gets well grounded and well established. And then you have a starter. And we'll talk about how to maintain starters, whether on the countertop or in the fridge. We'll discuss that in the upcoming videos. So I hope this helps you. And I hope you've enjoyed this little part 3 of our how to start a sourdough starter. I'm going to say that one day without getting tongue-tied. How to start a sourdough starter series. So, good Lord willing, I'll see you in part 4. Take care, y'all. Bye.